Michael Hudson, welcome back to the Hudson Report.
Oh, it's good to be back. I'm just back from China now, just getting over jet lag.
Yeah, and you recently gave an important speech at Peking University about the economy and what sorts of policies they should look to implement and ones to avoid. The full transcript of that speech is up on counterpunch.org, and we'll include a link in the show notes. But Michael, because we only have a short amount of time in these weekly segments, I wanted to look specifically at housing in China, and then in a bit compare that to what's going on here in the U.S. In your speech, you argue that China's most pressing policy challenges are to keep down the cost of housing, and that the best policies suited for China's economy are the ones that can avoid what you call a neo-rentier disease. Maybe first, briefly give us a picture of what's going on currently with housing in China, and then explain what you mean by the term neo-rentier disease and what you are recommending the Chinese do to avoid it.
Well, just to put this in international perspective, you could say that international competition is basically a rivalry among labor's basic cost of living in each country. And the most important aspect in every country's cost of living now is the cost of housing. So what makes a country competitive in manufacturing or industry or other things for international trade is going to be how much it costs to live in a house. And maybe 20 or 30 years ago, only 10%, 12% of one's income had to go for housing. Well, in America today, it's in the big cities, it's 40%. And it's 40% in London and England, too. And it's rising in Europe. And this is not a force of nature. It doesn't have to be this way. It's largely because banks have found that they can do with housing the same thing they've done with education. Housing is an excuse to get people into debt. And the way that you get people into debt for housing is, for one thing, you take control of the government with your lobbyists, and you make sure that you untax housing. There's no property tax, or it goes way, way down. And so all this rental value, the rising value of housing, is all a function of bank credit. So the reason housing prices are going up is because a house is worth whatever a bank will lend. Well, you'd think that China would have learned this by looking at the West, or even by reading Volume 3 of Capital. And in fact, at the Peking meeting, which was the second global meeting of Marxism by Peking University, which has the Marxist school, was a talk by David Harvey. And Harvey's point was that if the Chinese claim to be Marxists, they should read Volume 3 of Capital, and they'll see all about how the volume of debt and credit grows exponentially, and as banks get richer and richer, and as the 1% get richer and richer, they need more and more markets, and so they lend on easier and easier terms, a higher proportion of the home's value, and it's bank credit that's been inflating the price of housing. And David Harvey asked in his closing talk, how can you in China let the price of housing go up so much in Shanghai, which is the most privatized city, so high that almost everybody who has a house is a millionaire there? How can you expect to remain competitive in exporting your industrial products when prices are so high? And unfortunately, his talk and mine, both on the same topic, were about the only economic talks at the meeting in Peking, because as one of the Russian attendees pointed out to me, Marxism is the Chinese word for politics. And it just means what their talk is politically. And they've said Marxism with Chinese characteristics means we're going to do what we want politically, but economically, we've sent our students to the United States, to business schools, to learn how to do things there. And Shanghai, of course, was where Milton Friedman and the Chicago Boys came in the 1970s and early 80s, because Mao's government, the Chinese Party government, didn't want Western Marxists there. They said, no, if a Western Marxist comes and talks to us, they're going to interfere with our own domestic Chinese politics. We'd better get non-Marxists come coming here. So actually, China has had very little exposure to Marxian economics. Well, as I began to talk to the students there, I gave the same basic talk in Tianjin, which is a much more interesting city in many ways to the northwest. It became apparent that talking to the women especially, I'd ask the women students, and 80% of the economic students were women, because it's considered a social science there. How are you going to get an apartment? They said, we've got to marry a boy whose parents give him an apartment. I didn't meet any male student who said, I've got to marry a woman with her own apartment. It's always you marry it's the male's role to have an apartment for the woman. And so what you're having there is, if you can't find a guy with his own apartment, this is not going to lead to a happy married life, and probably won't end up with a marriage at all. Well, some of the students that I talked to 3 years ago when I was there are graduating now, but they're still not married. So I said, well, how do you get an apartment? Well, one of the problems I found out in China, in addition to what we just talked about, was in order to stop the rural exodus to the cities, people from the provinces or from small towns are not allowed to get a passport, as it were, to live in the big city. So they're not allowed to buy apartments in the cities, but only in their hometown. They're trying to prevent overcrowding and just really the development of slums there. So there's a logic to the policy. But what that means is that in order to get an apartment, the student said, okay, well, I have to teach at a university or at the high school of a university that has its own housing. So China's developing corporations, public sector, universities, and others, very much like the Russians, Soviets did, where the corporate employers would provide their own workers housing. And you're having that in China. Well, meanwhile, you're having this move in the last 3 years under President Xi against corruption. And the way that they've moved against corruption is to put in a bureaucracy to prevent corruption. There wasn't any other intermediate step away from corruption. And the bureaucracy is sort of to put a straitjacket around what government spending can limit on. So most governments, including universities, if they have big conferences, they need a private sector participant to go and share in the costs, especially if they bring people over from abroad, and they have to reimburse the cost of getting a visa, part of the airfare, and such. So you've essentially, you're shifting corruption from the public sector into the private sector where it belongs. You could say. So there's a whole shift going on in China now, and the political attitude of the students I talked to are quite different from they were like 9 years ago, when all the students really thought, hey, we can really change the country. We're going to get rid of corruption. Okay, they've got rid of corruption. They put bureaucracy. But meanwhile, they're faced with the problem that they're having their students have all been sent to America to study economics. They come back and say, well, how do we have a free market? Well, I couldn't believe that in China, students were asking me about a free market. And the free market, of course, has led Xi a few months ago to say, well, we're thinking of letting the American and the European banks in there. Well, I thought this is going to be a disaster. If you let in the American and foreign banks, what are they going to, their product is debt. And what are they going to lend money on? They're going to lend more money to get apartments than other Chinese banks are going to lend. They'll lend on easier terms, lower down payment, so that other people can get apartments. And this is going to provide buyers with even more credit to bid up the price of real estate, pricing China out of the market. And this is the way to, it's a self-destructive move by China, because property's worth whatever a bank will lend. And foreign banks are going to be more reckless, as they were in America, because what the Chinese don't get is that the business plan of American banks is fraud. They showed that. Bill Black has shown that, in his analysis of what happened after the 2008 crisis. The whole junk mortgage crisis was a fraud crisis. This is about to be repeated in China. The whole plan is that this is a Trojan horse to financially bid up the price of housing and maybe even education and anything else the banks can make loans on, making the debt so high that Chinese workers can't produce goods that are competitive internationally.
Well, I wanted to ask you about the issue specifically right now of debt in China. I mean, their private debt bubble is basically the biggest in the history of capitalism. I think in the 2017 numbers had it at about 220% of GDP. So, I mean, what do you think is going to happen there with the broader economy?
Under current conditions, nothing. It's not a problem. And here's why. The debts are owed to the government banks. Now, a government can do what the U.S. can't do. The government can just forgive the debt. And in every case where a viable corporation has run into too much debt, the government may throw in jail the reckless corporate leaders, or it may remove them, but the government can forgive the debt, and when it forgives the debt, it doesn't smash up the factory or let it be sold to a predatory asset management firm like in the United States. Now, this is the advantage of having a public credit, and why credit should be public, as it was in Babylonia and Mesopotamia. The rulers were canceling debts all the time in the third millennium, the second millennium BC, because most debts were owed to the palace or the temples, and they were canceling debts owed to themselves. China can cancel the corporate debt and the business debt owed to itself. It can proclaim a clean slate. It can minimize the debt service to whatever it chooses. But if it lets in foreign banks, imagine if Chase Manhattan and Goldman Sachs are let in there, it's going to be much harder for the Chinese government to say, okay, we're going to lower all the real estate tax. We're going to raise the real estate taxes and lead to defaults on the banks. But we fixed matters with the tenants, so we'll make new loans to the tenants who default. Well, you can imagine the international furor that would erupt. Trump would threaten to atom bomb Peking and Shanghai to save his constituency, Wall Street, because his constituency and the Democrats are the same, the Wall Street 1%. So China is losing this ability to write down debts if it lets in foreign banks, and that was what the big political discussion was. When I did discuss economics at the Chinese Academy of Sciences in Beijing and at Tianjin University, where we're going to have a conference on fictitious capital, I think this October.
Michael, I know you briefly explained this a bit earlier in our conversation, but when we were emailing today about doing this segment, you tipped me off to a new book by the London-based economist Josh Ryan Collins that essentially shows that unaffordable housing is not a part of true nature. That's really counter to the way most people believe that housing actually works. Can you explain that in a little bit more detail?
Yes, it's natural for people intuitively to think, well, housing prices are going up because people have more money to spend, or the population is going up. But housing prices are going up even where population isn't going up, like in London or Australia. And the reason that's going up is that banks are making more and more reckless loans. They've lowered the amount of down payments. They've stretched out the mortgages to interest-only mortgages, and they've basically had convinced government to pick up most of the costs. And once you're able to pick up mortgages and sell them to somebody else, the bank doesn't care whether the owners, the buyers, can pay. So you can have someone without a job, without an income, with no assets at all, the ninja borrowers that were infamous in 2008, and if you lend them $1 million to buy an apartment, well, they're going to live there for 3 months and then default if they can borrow 100% of the mortgage, as they could in 2008. But that's going to bid up the price of everybody's apartment. Something like that, towards that, has happened in London. It's happened throughout Europe. It's happened in New York. It's happened throughout most of the United States. And the price of housing is growing not because of people are more popular, prosperous. They're paying more and more and more of their paycheck for housing, and it's the rising price of housing, as we've discussed before, that has them cut back on their other consumer spending, so that they don't have enough money to spend on goods and services, and that's why now you're finding whole buildings like 666 Fifth Avenue that Trump's son-in-law Kutcher owns. It's 40% empty. So he had to go to Qatar, right near Saudi Arabia, and said, "Look, I will make our foreign policy serve you if you will give me a loan to bail out this building there." So it's just amazing how you're having New York commercial real estate being bailed out by Trump's foreign Near Eastern policy. You're having business rents in New York going down because there's no one to sell to buy in the stores, because they have to spend so much money on the apartments they rent just to live in New York City or its environs.
Yeah, and this is a really good transition into what I want to ask you about millennials and the U.S. housing market, because a good chunk of our listeners are in the millennial generation, and some of those people have reached out to us knowing that we do these weekly episodes with you and have wanted to get your take on the state of the U.S. housing market. I know you just shared a little bit about it, but I presume they want that information because some of them are straddling that line where maybe they just make just enough to afford housing, but it's still a pretty daunting investment, and a lot of younger adults are still scarred from what they saw happen maybe to their family, their neighbors, or communities during 2007, 2008. By the numbers, millennials are definitely buying less homes than older generations have, and lots are definitely rejecting the notion that they need to buy a home. Although there's still that profound cultural pressure here in America that owning a home is a good investment, that owning a home is the ultimate, symbol of prosperity, success, and tangible proof that you're living the so-called American dream. And some people who have reached out to us have even been so forthright just to ask point blank, can you ask Michael Hudson whether it's worth it or a safe investment or whatever for me to get into the housing market? Of course, bearing in mind that there's no blanket answer here, people's personal finances, where they're looking to buy the home, how much other types of debt they might be in, all would play a role in assessing that. But excluding the few young people, trust fund babies who are wealthy enough to buy a house without batting an eyelash, what could you say about specifically the U.S. housing market right now to someone who is young and who is genuinely torn on whether to take out a mortgage on a house that might inform them on how to make that decision a little bit better?
Well, first of all, as you just hinted at, there are two classes of millennials now. We have a class difference. One class of millennia inherits the houses from their parents, or have a trust fund, or the parents have paid for their education in full and have helped them get a house, or have given them their house. Those are the millennials that have housing. The rest of the millennials, I don't see how they can get housing, especially if they have a student loan, because the banks now have become subject to higher lending standards, and the higher lending standards mean that, well, if you already have to pay 15 to 20% of your income for your student loan or other bank loans, then you're not going to have the 40% of your income left to spend on the mortgage. That is what it takes now that we just raised interest rates last week to 5 and maybe 5.3%. And we were not going to lend you as much money as we used to. You're going now actually have to make a down payment of 20%, maybe 30%, and you're going to have to pay off the mortgage in a shorter time. So unless the millennials can get their parents to co-sign, they're not going to. It's not going to be practical for them to have a home. So you're really having. It's not a generation gap, because the rich millennials, the middle class millennials that have parents helping them are in one class, and the millennials that are self-supporting, which used to be just about everybody was self-supporting once they're in their late 20s, you can't afford to be self-supporting anymore if you're in your 20s or 30s. And if you are self-supporting and you have a job, you certainly can't ask for a raise because you could be escorted out very quickly. And you can't go on strike because then you'd miss the mortgage payment and you'd lose your house. So they're painted into a corner. So sure, housing is a very good investment if you have millionaire parents. But if you don't have a millionaire parents, you're stuck, and don't worry, you couldn't get a bank loan anyway. I mean, it's really become that extreme. Now, the problem is, how can they rent in New York when the average rent is $4,500 a month? They'd have to move out to the suburbs with a roommate. And even so, here you have again the problem that I mentioned that China solved, the student debt problem. Basically, the government should abolish the student debt so that it would enable this class of millennials to use their money to make a down payment for an apartment and to actually get a place to live like everybody for the last 100 years has been able to do. But this is a real change, and I don't think people realize the radical damage that Obama did to the economy by bailing out the banks and not rolling back the terms of bank credit to keep housing affordable. Obama basically said, make housing unaffordable. You can make your junk loans. He didn't punish any bankers. He didn't regulate the bankers, and he's created the situation that Trump has inherited. That is, he's just pushed it to a further degree with full Democratic support. The Democratic donor class loves Trump, which is they want him to be reelected because he's cutting their taxes. He's deregulating the banks. He's essentially deregulated fraud, this leaves the millennials in a real problem. How can they cope with a situation where they don't have anyone representing their interest, either in Congress, where it's really the same party now, or in an opportunity to earn their way to get housing? It's very hard to earn the money that you need to buy a house anymore. There has to be God in the machine, Deus ex machina, meaning rich parents or a rich uncle.
Yeah, so maybe a better investment for millennials would be to organize outside the banks.
Well, here's the other problem. In the Congress last week, Frida deregulated the community banks. And I've worked as a consultant for community banks in Chicago before. And the community bank strategy is, well, we're going to get business by making more reckless loans than the commercial banks. And so they're regulated, so we can make even higher debt-to-equity ratios. We can make even lower down payments, and we can help bid up the price of real estate even more. So the congressional rewriting of the bank regulations law last week makes it much harder for millennials to get an apartment because it's bid up it's inflated the price of housing with yet more bank credit.
Well, Michael, like every week, I wish we had more time to talk, but I did want to let everyone know who's in the greater New York area that this coming Saturday, June 2nd at 2 p.m. at the Left Forum in Manhattan at John Jay, I'll be moderating a panel between Michael Hudson and Michael Perelman about the long pedigree of anti-labor and anti-reform junk economics from the 18th century classical economists to the Austrians and modern mainstream. You can get more info about that on leftforum.org. Again, that's leftforum.org. But Michael Hudson, thanks again for joining us on this week's edition of the Hudson Report.
Well, it's good to be here. I'm glad we had a chance to talk about real estate for a change.